The bell above the door jingled as Malcolm Tate stepped into the diner, the scent of fresh coffee and fried bacon cutting through the late afternoon air. It was the kind of place where the booths were cracked from years of use, where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down. A small-town spot, the kind he had always liked until today. He had barely made it to the counter before he felt the eyes on him. From the far side of the diner, two cops sat at the counter, their uniforms crisp, their voices just loud enough to carry. One of them, Sergeant Ray Danning, was leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee like he owned the place. And he was watching Malcolm. Malcolm ignored it. He was used to stares, used to the quiet tension that came from being the only black man in certain spaces. But something about the way Danning smirked put him on edge. "Table or counter, hun?" The waitress, a young blonde woman with tired eyes, gave him a small smile. He returned it, nodding toward the counter. He didn't sit in corners, didn't sit with his back to the door. Old habits. The second he took his seat, Danning spoke, voice just loud enough to be heard. "Man, they let anybody in here these days, huh?" His partner chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess so." Malcolm exhaled, fingers tightening against the menu. Not today. He turned his attention to the waitress as she poured his coffee, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. No sudden gestures, nothing that could be misconstrued. Danning, however, wasn't done. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." "Bet he's one of those guys who served just to get a free ride," he said, loud enough that even the cook behind the grill paused mid-order. Malcolm's fingers curled around the coffee cup. That one hit a little harder than it should have. "Yeah," Danning continued, taking another sip. "Probably some security guard or delivery guy now. Ain't that right, big man?" His partner laughed, and Malcolm finally looked up. His gaze locked onto Danning's. The room went silent. Even the waitress stiffened, her hands frozen around the coffee pot. Malcolm's voice was calm, controlled, the same voice he used when standing before high-ranking officers in a war zone. "You got something you want to say to me, officer?" Danning grinned, but Malcolm could see the challenge in his eyes. "Nah," he said, "just making conversation. You know, civilians like to talk to the folks that actually did something with their lives." Malcolm felt a rush of heat crawl up his neck, but he shoved it down. He had heard worse. But then Danning leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to be personal. "Thing is, guys like you, always talking about service like it makes you better than the rest of us," he said. "But let's be real. How many of y'all actually did something over there?" The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. Not because they were true, but because he had buried men who would never come home. Men who had given everything. For a second, his vision blurred with memory. Sand, sweat, gunfire in the distance. Then he blinked, and it was gone. Malcolm slowly placed his coffee cup down, inhaling deep through his nose. He could feel the weight of every eye in the diner watching, waiting to see what he would do. The young waitress looked downright panicked now, her hands twisting in the edge of her apron. "Officer," Malcolm said finally, voice low and even, "I don't know what your problem is, but I'd suggest you finish your coffee and let me finish mine." Danning chuckled, shaking his head. "Calm down, soldier boy. Just having a little fun." His partner, who had the decency to look uncomfortable now, mumbled, "Maybe we should get going." Danning ignored him. He was enjoying this. Malcolm didn't take the bait. Instead, he picked up his fork, cutting into his eggs, forcing himself to act like this conversation wasn't happening. Then he heard it. The quiet chime of a phone recording. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but he caught it immediately. From the corner of his eye, he saw her, a woman at the back of the diner, phone raised, camera pointed straight at them. She knew exactly what was happening. Danning, however, didn't notice. He kept going, digging himself deeper. "Man, I don't even know why you people joined the military anyway," he muttered. "It ain't like you ever got a fair shot before. Thought putting on a uniform was gonna change that?" His partner froze. The waitress sucked in a sharp breath. Malcolm went still. The energy in the diner had shifted. Everyone knew Danning had just crossed the line, even Danning himself. The grin on his face wavered just slightly, but Malcolm saw it, that flicker of realization. He had gone too far. And now? There was a camera rolling. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. He let the silence stretch between them. let Danning feel the weight of what he had just done. Then, calmly, he turned toward the woman with the phone and nodded once. She nodded back. The message was clear. This was going to go public, and Danning had no idea what was coming next. The video hit the internet like a wildfire, spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time Malcolm Tate got home that evening, his phone was already buzzing with messages, missed calls, and social media notifications that refused to stop. He wasn't surprised. The diner had been nearly full when it happened. People had seen, had heard, had sat in uncomfortable silence as that cop ran his mouth. But the difference this time was simple. Someone had captured it. The woman who had been recording, Lisa Carter, a local journalist, had wasted no time. She uploaded the footage to Twitter with the caption, "Watch this cop harass and mock a Black Marine veteran for no reason. This is what we mean when we talk about systemic disrespect. There's justice for Malcolm." Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. By morning, it had been seen by millions. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, scrolling through hundreds of comments from people he had never met but who were now rallying behind him. "This is disgusting. That cop needs to be fired. How do you disrespect a man who risked his life for this country? This is exactly why we need police reform. Imagine how he treats people when cameras aren't rolling." He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Malcolm hadn't asked to be the face of anything. He hadn't asked to have his name attached to a new viral outrage, hadn't wanted to wake up to find his face plastered across news articles and social media threads. But here he was. His phone rang. Jordan Ellis' name flashed across the screen. Malcolm exhaled, setting his coffee down before answering. "Ellis." Jordan didn't waste time. "How fast can you be at my office?" Malcolm glanced at the clock. "What's going on?" Jordan's voice was sharp. "We have a situation." He sighed. "I take it this is about the video." A humorless laugh on the other end. "You're trending higher than the damn president right now. It's bigger than the video." Malcolm already knew where this was going. "The department's pushing back, aren't they?" "They're not just pushing back," Jordan said. "They're smearing you." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly. Of course they were. He grabbed his jacket and his keys. "I'm on my way." Inside Jordan's downtown office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The moment Malcolm walked in, she was already pulling up headlines on her screen, flipping through articles that had been published in the past few hours. The police department had wasted no time going on the defensive. "Viral clip taken out of context," says police chief. Officer Danning under fire, but was the veteran really the victim? Sources say Malcolm Tate has a history of confrontations with law enforcement. Malcolm barked out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "They're trying to make me the aggressor," he muttered. Jordan's eyes were dark. "Of course they are. That's how they play the game." Malcolm exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Jordan folded her arms. "So, here's the deal. You can sit back and let them twist this. Let them make you look like the angry black man who intimidated an officer into saying stupid things. Or," she smiled, "or you go public, on your terms." Malcolm raised a brow. "You mean a press conference?" "I mean a full-scale PR offensive." Jordan pulled a folder from her desk, flipping it open. "I've already got veterans organizations and civil rights groups reaching out, offering support. The police department wants this to go away? Fine. We make sure that doesn't happen." Malcolm was quiet for a long moment, staring at the articles on the screen. He had never wanted to be this guy, never wanted to be the headline, the controversy, the man giving speeches on the steps of City Hall. But the truth was, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every other black man who had been mocked, disrespected, pushed aside by the same people who were supposed to protect them. This was about every veteran who had come home only to find that the country they bled for didn't see them as anything more than a uniform. He met Jordan's eyes. "When's the press conference?" Jordan smirked. "Tomorrow morning." Malcolm nodded. "Then let's get to work." By the time Malcolm stepped onto the podium the next morning, the crowd was already bigger than he expected. Reporters lined the front, their cameras trained on him. Behind them, a growing crowd of veterans, activists, and everyday citizens held signs in support. One in particular caught his eye. "Respect our veterans. Fire Danning." The podium microphone crackled as he adjusted it. He exhaled once, steady, focused. Then he began. "My name is Malcolm Tate. I served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps. I fought in 2 wars. I came home with scars most of you will never see." He paused, letting his words settle. But none of that mattered to Officer Danning. The camera zoomed in. To him, I wasn't a Marine. I wasn't a man who served my country. I was just another black guy in a diner, someone to be laughed at, to be mocked by the people who were supposed to protect me. A murmur passed through the crowd. I wish I could say I was surprised, but the truth is, this isn't new. This isn't the first time. It won't be the last, unless we do something about it. Lisa Carter stood in the crowd, her phone raised, streaming it all live. Thousands of people were watching. "I'm not asking for an apology," Malcolm continued. "I don't want one. I want accountability. I want real change. I want a world where a man who serves his country isn't disrespected by the people who wear the badge. And I want every officer like Danning to know, you don't get to hide anymore." The crowd erupted. The press fired off questions. Jordan smiled from the side, knowing they had just won the narrative. Malcolm stepped back from the podium, his jaw tight, his pulse steady. Officer Danning had started this. But now Malcolm was finishing it. And Danning. He had no idea what was coming next. The press conference had been a firestorm, but Malcolm Tate knew that words alone weren't enough. Now it was time for action. The public pressure against Officer Danning had been relentless. The video of him mocking Malcolm had been picked apart on news channels, analyzed by political commentators, and turned into a rallying cry across social media. Veterans groups were demanding action. Civil rights organizations were calling for an investigation. Even the mayor had been forced to comment. But the police department? They were stalling. A vague statement had been issued, calling the incident unfortunate, but claiming it did not violate department policy. The chief had refused to comment further, saying they would review the situation internally. Malcolm knew exactly what that meant. They were hoping this would blow over. He wasn't going to let that happen. Inside Jordan Ellis's downtown office, the atmosphere was tense but charged with purpose. A dozen people sat around the conference table, lawyers, veteran advocates, and activists, all working toward the same goal. Jordan stood at the front, flipping through documents. The department wants to drag its feet? Fine. Let's make it impossible for them to ignore us. She looked up, eyes sharp. We're filing a formal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Danning and the police department. The room buzzed with murmurs of approval. Malcolm nodded, arms crossed. And what does that actually get us? Jordan smiled. It forces them to go on the defensive. A lawsuit means depositions, evidence collection, internal reviews. And given what Detective Knox just sent me, they should be very nervous. Malcolm leaned forward. What do you mean? Jordan slid a thick folder across the table. Malcolm opened it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the first few pages. Danning had a history. Over a dozen complaints for racial profiling, multiple excessive force allegations, a history of harassing Black and Latino men during routine stops. And the worst part? None of it had ever led to consequences. They buried it, Malcolm muttered, shaking his head. Jordan smirked. Not anymore. We go public with this, and Danning is done. But it's bigger than him. We use this case to demand real reform, body cams that actually stay on, an independent review board for officer misconduct, stronger disciplinary actions for repeat offenders. Lisa Carter, the journalist who had filmed the incident, leaned forward. And I'll make sure every reporter in the country knows about it. Malcolm exhaled. It was happening. Danning had wanted a fight. Now, he was getting a war. The lawsuit made headlines. The police department scrambled, trying to control the fallout, but it was too late. News stations ran deep dives into Danning's history. Former victims of his profiling came forward, sharing their own stories. The mayor, desperate to save face, announced an independent review of the department. And then, the protests started. Hundreds of people gathered outside the police station, demanding Danning's resignation. Veterans, activists, and everyday citizens stood side by side, holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans," "Fire Danning," "Justice for Malcolm." The station was on lockdown. Danning hadn't been seen in days. Inside his apartment, he was watching it all unravel on the news, his face pale, his jaw tight. His phone rang. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. The phone rang. He answered. It was his union representative. You need to make a statement, the man said, voice tense. Danning scoffed. What am I supposed to say? I'm sorry for telling the truth? Listen to me, the rep snapped. This isn't going away. The department is cutting you loose. You're toxic now. Danning's stomach twisted. They can't just... They can, and they are. Danning gripped his phone tighter. He had been untouchable for years. He had laughed in the face of complaints, walked away from investigations, kept his badge no matter what. But now, the world was watching, and he wasn't untouchable anymore. 2 days later, the police chief held a press conference. After careful review of the evidence, the chief said, reading stiffly from a statement, Sergeant Danning's conduct has been found in violation of department standards. Effective immediately, he has been terminated from the force. The crowd erupted into cheers. Malcolm watched from the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Lisa Carter turned to him, grinning. We got him. Malcolm nodded. We did. But he wasn't smiling, because he knew the real fight wasn't about one bad cop. The real fight was about making sure there weren't more like him, and that was just getting started. The day Sergeant Ray Danning was officially fired, Malcolm Tate stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, staring at the flashing cameras and roaring crowd, but feeling none of it. He had won, but it didn't feel like a victory, not yet. Danning was done, sure, stripped of his badge, disgraced on national television, tossed aside by the very department that had protected him for years. He had walked into that station believing he was untouchable, believing that no matter what he said, no matter what he did, there would be no consequences. But today he had walked out with his badge in a box. Malcolm should have felt satisfied. Instead, he felt the weight of something much heavier pressing down on him. Because he knew better than anyone, Danning was just one man, and taking down one man wasn't enough. He exhaled, stepping away from the cameras, away from the shouting reporters, away from the noise. Lisa Carter caught up to him first, her phone still raised, still recording. How does it feel? She asked, breathless from pushing through the crowd. Justice served? Malcolm turned to her, his expression unreadable. This wasn't justice, he said. This was a reckoning. Lisa lowered her phone slightly. Then what's next? Malcolm didn't answer right away. He looked out over the crowd, the veterans holding signs, the young black men watching him like he was something bigger than just a man, the activists chanting for more accountability. He knew exactly what was next. 3 months later, the Tate Initiative was born. It started in a single rented office, a converted community center with peeling paint and secondhand furniture. But it didn't matter, because the people showed up. Veterans who had been wrongfully arrested, denied jobs, harassed by police, young men looking for guidance, mentorship, protection, lawyers offering free legal aid, business owners pledging jobs and housing for veterans in need. And Malcolm was at the center of it all. He hadn't planned on this. He had never wanted to be a public figure, but the second he saw a man who had nearly lost his home because of an unfair arrest record, the second he heard another black veteran tell a story too similar to his own, he knew he couldn't just walk away. This wasn't a moment. This was a movement. But change didn't come without enemies. Late one night, Malcolm sat at his desk, reviewing the latest reports on the Tate Initiative's cases, when Jordan Ellis stormed into his office. We have a problem, she said, throwing a file down in front of him. He flipped it open, eyes narrowing. It was a cease and desist letter from the police union. They're trying to shut us down, Jordan said, claiming the Tate Initiative is inciting hostility against law enforcement. Malcolm scoffed. Hostility? We're defending veterans from bad cops. If that's a problem, maybe they should take a harder look at who they're protecting. Jordan sat down, rubbing her temples. They're scared. They're seeing the momentum, the pressure. We're forcing actual reform, and they don't like it. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling. So what's the play? Jordan smirked. We don't back down. A week later, Malcolm was standing before Congress. The hearing room was packed. The whole country was watching. Mr. Tate, one of the senators said, adjusting his glasses. You've become quite the controversial figure. Malcolm tilted his head. Controversial to who? The senator cleared his throat. There are those who feel that the Tate Initiative is pushing an anti-law enforcement agenda. Malcolm let out a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. With all due respect, sir, if holding bad cops accountable is anti-law enforcement, then maybe law enforcement needs to rethink what side they're on. Murmurs rippled through the room. Another senator, a woman who had supported Malcolm's case from the start, leaned forward. Mr. Tate, what exactly is your goal with the Tate Initiative? Malcolm straightened. My goal is simple. No veteran who fought for this country should have to come home and fight their own police department just to be treated with dignity. No one should be profiled, harassed, or arrested because of the color of their skin. And every officer who abuses their power should face real consequences, just like Ray Danning did. The room fell silent. One of the reporters in the back whispered, "Damn!" By the time Malcolm left the hearing, the bill to create independent review boards for police misconduct cases had enough support to move forward. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Outside the Capitol, Logan Myers, his best friend from the Marines, stood waiting for him, arms crossed. Congress? Logan smirked. You trying to be a politician now? Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. Hell no. Logan clapped him on the back. Too late, brother. You're already leading a damn revolution. Malcolm exhaled, looking out over the city. Maybe he was. And maybe it was exactly what needed to happen, because this fight wasn't over, not even close. 1 year later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Tate Initiative National Headquarters was small, just how Malcolm wanted it. No press, no grand speeches, just the people who had built it, the people it was going to help. He stood in front of the glass doors, a pair of scissors in hand. Lisa Carter, now a full-time journalist covering police reform, smiled at him. Feels surreal, huh? Malcolm nodded. A little. Jordan stood beside him, arms crossed. You ready for what comes next? Malcolm smirked. Always. He cut the ribbon. The doors opened, and the future walked in.